last few sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, we've been introduced to some colossal names such as Thomas B. Marsh, Parley P. Pratt, Orson Pratt, Sidney Rigdon, and now one last colossal name that gets introduced in these sections right here, a man by the name of Edward Partridge. Edward Partridge will go on to become the first bishop in the restored church, one of the great men and the great servants of God in the history of this dispensation. Well, what brought Edward into the church? It begins with Parley P. Pratt, who, after he's converted, goes on his mission and finds Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon is the one to bring Edward Partridge in because Edward Partridge lived in Ohio and became a follower of Sidney Rigdon, with Sidney acting as his teacher and spiritual advisor. When Sidney Rigdon joins the church and then wants to travel to New York to meet Joseph Smith, Edward Partridge decides he wants to go to New York as well and meet Joseph Smith, but Edward Partridge has not yet been baptized, and this is kind of where the story picks up. His wife said that Edward partly believed, but he wouldn't fully commit until he was able to meet Joseph Smith. When he gets to New York, he inquires of all the locals about Joseph Smith's character, quote, which they stated had been unimpeachable until Joseph deceived us relative to the Book of Mormon, end of quote. Having heard that their beliefs were the only thing inciting prejudice against them, he was ready to be baptized. And then he said, quote, if Brother Joseph will baptize me. And Joseph baptized Edward the next day, and shortly after that received Doctrine and Covenants 36 for him. Edward Partridge does exactly as this revelation is going to tell him to do, to labor in the vineyard of the Lord for the souls of men. And we're so grateful for Parley for bringing in Sidney, who brought in Edward, who brought many unto Christ.